Well, hello and welcome. First of all, I'd like to thank the library for having me here today. But just as important, all of you who were brave enough to show up to talk about Wisconsin's gangster history from the safety of wherever you're watching this program from. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you here. One second. If I can, some reason it's not bringing up. Well, there we go. Bear with me one second here. So right now, all of you should see Wisconsin's gangster past. Hopefully you can all see that. So again, welcome. My name's Chad Lewis. I'll be your presenter for this program. And although my background is actually in the field of psychology, for the last nearly 30 years, I've been traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from roadside attractions and odd places to cruising the old mother road, weird people, you name it. If it's just strange and a little offbeat, I've traveled the globe in search of these oddities, these anomalies, and just downright weird stories. But it wasn't until the early 2000s when I was up in the Northwoods of Wisconsin working on a book about Wisconsin ghosts when my car got a flat tire. So I got out, fixed the flat, worked up a little thirst. I looked over and I happened to be right in front of a lodge. So I thought I'd drop in and grab a can of pop. Well, lo and behold, that place was called Little Bohemia. I didn't know it at the time, but it seemed as though fate had stepped in and provided a little detour from things that go bump in the night to things that can bump you off. And that eventually became the book and the program you're going to see today. And I really want this program today to be a time portal back to the days when the gangsters robbed our banks, they kidnapped our citizens, and they mowed down everybody who got in their way. So for the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to travel the state to the gangsters' hotspots. Now, of course, today, the gangsters themselves, they no longer hang out at any of these places, but the locations themselves are still there. But for how much longer, I don't know. I always encourage people to get to these places while you still can, because every year we're losing more and more of these historic treasures. So with that, let's explore the gangster history of Wisconsin. If you have any questions throughout the program, throw them in the chat room. There'll be time at the end for us to go over any questions, comments, or stories that any of you might have. So with that, throw on your zoot suit or your flapper dress as we explore Wisconsin's weird gangster history. The first question we have to ask is, what was it about Wisconsin that the gangsters loved? Why were they here so much? Well, there were numerous reasons. The first being, obviously, our close proximity to Chicago, which was the bootlegging capital of the world during Prohibition. Mainly run by Al Scarface Capone on the left of your screen, and one of his arch nemesis, George Bugs Moran, on the right. A lot of people know of Al thanks in part to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929. It happened on Valentine's Day. Al wanted to get rid of Bugs, who was using this as his makeshift headquarters, this building as his secret headquarters. And in order to get rid of Bugs, Al came up with a great idea. While Al was down in Florida vacationing with an alibi, he had several of his colleagues dress up as police officers and raid the place. And that's exactly what they did. They went inside, dressed as officers. Now, Bugs's men, they thought it was your traditional shakedown. They put their weapons down. They thought they'd just pay off the police and go about their business as usual. But as soon as they put their weapons down, they realized these were not police officers. It was too late. Capone's men fired on them. The garage had a dog, and the dog was barking so loud that a neighbor lady sent one of her tenants over to see what was going on. Now, word of caution here. You'll see this 3 or 4 times in the program. And what it means is that the next slide might be graphic, gory, or gruesome. You might not want to see it. Feel free to close your eyes. I'll tell you when the slide is gone if you'd rather not see. Because I'm going to show you why that dog was barking so loud and what that tenant found when he came over. Because when he came into the building, this is what he discovered. All of the men were on the ground dead or in a state of dying. Okay, the photo's gone. The dog was so distraught it couldn't be put to relaxing. It had to be put down. It was the only survivor, and it too had to end. Now, Bugs Moran, he wasn't there that day. He had seen the police coming and turned around and kept walking. The case was never officially solved. But when the media asked Bugs who he thought was responsible, he said there's only one person in the world that kills like that, and that's Capone. A few years back, while Chicago was trying to get rid of their gangster image, they tore down the building where the massacre took place. It is now the front yard of a senior area. But don't worry, like anything today, if you want, you can go online and buy one of the original bricks from the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The second reason they loved Wisconsin is that they loved Minnesota, St. Paul. And the quickest way to get from Chicago to St. Paul was through our state. The reason they loved St. Paul is because of this police chief, John O'Connor. Back in the early 1900s, when every other community was trying to keep criminals out of their city, O'Connor took a different approach. He invited crooks to St. Paul. So if you were a criminal from anywhere, you could go to St. Paul, register with the police, and do whatever the heck you wanted. Prostitution, no problem. Gambling, be our guest. But there was one catch. You couldn't do it in the city of St. Paul. Therefore, if you wanted to go to Wilmer, Minnesota and rob their banks, which you can see they did, you could, but there'd be no crime inside St. Paul. That meant that in the 20s and 30s, there were more criminals living in the saintly city than nearly anywhere else in the world. Yet it was safer for you to live there than nearly anywhere as well. In fact, so many crooks were up there that noted bank robber Elvin Creepy Karpis once stated that if he was looking for a friend of his that he hadn't seen in a while, he immediately thought of 2 places, prison or St. Paul, because if his buddy wasn't in one, they were in the other one. And the third main reason they loved Wisconsin is the same reason we love Wisconsin, the beautiful Northwoods. When both the literal and figurative heat was too much on them down in Chicago, they would come up to the Northwoods and relax in the seclusion and away from the prying eye of curious law enforcement. Now, it was during this time, during Prohibition, towns were either considered dry, meaning you couldn't get any spirits anywhere, or they were considered wet, which meant they had booze and spirits everywhere. Anyone want to guess which one Kenosha was? Well, if you believe all the newspaper accounts, all the arrests and all the folklore, it was a wet town. Here you have newspaper article after newspaper article. You can't flip through the local paper during Prohibition and not find them trying to discover all kinds of spirits. Here they raided one farm. They received over 900 gallons of booze from this one farm. Over 10 gallons of whiskey were there as well. And the cases go on and on and on. So the area was pretty wet, which only attracted more people to it. And of course, as we talked about, you can't throw a rock in Wisconsin without hearing about Al Capone being somewhere, from the Maribel Caves Hotel he was said to have owned, up in Door County, the Shipwreck Brew Pub, Capone's near Pipe, in Manitowoc, Capone's. Capone in Brookfield was said to own this home. It's pretty easy to find it. Just look for Capone Avenue and Court, and you'll find it. In Heaven City, he was said to be there by McWanago. All these places that are thought to be tied to Al himself. For someone who loves Chicago, it seems like he traveled quite a bit around the Midwest. But one place we do know that Al spent a lot of time is up in the aptly named hideout near Hayward and Couturier. Now, it's here that Al had this nice cabin built where he could bring up his colleagues and friends from down south, and they could come up and relax in the privacy and seclusion and luxury of his Northwoods cabin. Both Al and his brother Ralph Bottles Capone were avid outdoorsmen. They loved to hunt and fish, as did many of the men of that era, even if they were gangsters. But for Al, security was his number one concern, which is why he had a tower constructed on the property. 24 hours a day, he'd have his men armed with Tommy guns standing in the tower, watching all the entrances and exits, meaning that if you showed up to Al's uninvited, you'd probably receive a very unwelcome response when you got there. For years after Capone had this place, it operated as a tourist attraction, a roadside attraction you could pay to go and visit. Those who did were often confused at first by this building. They had no idea what it was used for on the property. But when they got close, they realized this is where Al did a lot of his negotiating with his competitors. He would bring them up north, put them in the jail. If they did not see his way of doing things, they would be found at the bottom of his lake where he had booze brought in from Canada, flown over. They felt like they never wanted to drain the lake because they were afraid of how many bodies they might find at the bottom. One of the deadliest gangs ever to set foot in Wisconsin was that of the Barker-Karpis gang, made up mainly of Alvin Creepy Karpis, remember prison or St. Paul, and whatever Barker boys happened to be out of prison at the time. Now, what Karpis was doing running with the Barkers, I don't know. Karpis was thought to be one of the most intelligent gangsters of all time. So why he was chumming with the Barkers, who, let's just say, were not the most intelligent, maybe that's why he loved them. But regardless, before we talk about the gang, we have to address the legend of their mother, Ma Barker. Many of you are probably familiar with the legend of Ma, and it goes something like this. That Ma was this mastermind, gun-toting criminal who took her young, innocent boys off on a life of crime, turning them into killers and criminals. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. We know Ma traveled with her boys. She had to have known they were criminals, but she had no active role in the participation or the planning of the crimes. We will catch up with Ma a little bit later down in Florida, and you'll see how the legend of Ma Barker began. But where she lacked in her criminal intent, her kids more than made up for it. You might recall this was the gang that back in 1933 kidnapped William Ham of the Ham's Brewing fortune. They kept him for a $100,000 ransom. Quite a sum of money back then. They treated him okay. They didn't hurt him. They brought him food. They even gave him beer. It wasn't Ham's. They didn't want to torture the poor guy. And then they let him go. 6 months later, they took Edward Bremer from the Bremer banking fortune, kept him for a $200,000 ransom. This allowed them to pay off the police and politicians that gave them safe homes all over the Midwest. And it was while they were staying at one safe house in St. Paul that things came to a quick turn for them. The house was on South Robert Street. You can see it here. It's still there. You can rent it. It was even up for sale a while back. They were staying there under the guise of being musicians, traveling with their senior mother. They rented the place out from the landlady who lived next door. But the landlady had a son who worked at a speakeasy. And one night he happened to be flipping through an old detective magazine when he saw what appeared to be those musicians living next to his mother. He saw the reward poster. So he immediately went down to the police station and said, "I'm here to collect the reward. The Barker-Karpis gang's living next to my mother." They put him in a back room and said, "You're going to be a hero. We'll take care of this with one phone call." Unfortunately, he ran into Big Tom Brown, perhaps the most corrupt police officer in Midwest history. But even though he was corrupt, he was a man of his word. He said he'd take care of it with one phone call, and he did. Guess who he called? The Barker-Karpis gang. He said, "The feds are raiding your place. Get the heck out of there." They had no idea it was this wanted poster that had done them in. They thought it was Ma's boyfriend, Mr. Dunlop. He was an alcoholic, and when he became intoxicated, he would brag about the exploits of the gang. So they believed that Minnesota was too hot for him. They had to get him out of there. Why not take him on a nice little vacation to Wisconsin? But this wasn't the type of vacation you'd want to go on, because this was one of those vacations you didn't come back from. They brought him up north near Siren in the Webster area to a place called Fremstead Lake that you saw there. There, they shot him several times, dumped his naked body on the side of the lake, and sprinkled a bunch of money on it to make it look like a mob hit. In fact, years later, after retiring, the local sheriff's officer used to go around jokingly claiming that this was the most profitable case he never investigated. They didn't care, just another dead gangster. In fact, when I dug up his death certificate, they had to list his occupation, which is about midway down on the left side of your screen. And you can see that it said unknown, suspected underworld character. Kind of a cool title to have back then, although usually meant you'd be dead on the side of a lake. But when the gangsters weren't robbing our banks and kidnapping our citizens, they loved to go to the speakeasies that were in Wisconsin. During Prohibition, speakeasies were places you could illegally go and drink, gamble, dance the night away, maybe partake in one of the ladies of the night that worked at these places. And they were everywhere. They were littered all over the state. In fact, we had so many speakeasies here that I think in Wisconsin, Prohibition was more of a suggestion than it was a law. One of their favorite places to go was a place called Ma Bailey's House of Ill Repute, just north of Minocqua in Woodruff. They called it Ma Bailey's back then, of course. What would happen is the gangsters would go into Minocqua and party the night away at places like the Belle Isle. Then they would go eat at Norwood Pines, the supper club, where you can still eat to this very day. They'd then take their fill and go out to Ma's place and spend the rest of their time there. As you can see, in the 20s and 30s, it was a sprawling estate, and it was risque. They had nude murals on the wall. And at one time, two young men coming home from a road trip from Rhinelander decided they wanted to stop into Ma's to see what all the fuss was about. But as soon as they walked in, they said, "We better get out of here." Because when they walked in, there was an X-rated movie being shown on the screen. But then the lights came up, they relaxed, had a few beers. The reason they relaxed is when the lights came up, they realized the man running the projector was the town judge. Therefore, they never closed down Ma's because everybody who could close it down was out at Ma's. They kept Ma's going until the 1950s. Now, you might be saying to yourself, how in the heck can a place operate until the 1950s? Well, they finally got her the same way they got Al Capone, tax evasion. They weren't upset that Ma was running a brothel up in the Northwoods of Wisconsin. They were upset because they weren't getting a cut of that piece of the brothel in the Northwoods. Eventually, they tried to make it as an actual legitimate bar and restaurant, and it went through many different businesses through the years. Eventually, it was reverted back to a public private home, a resident home. And I keep my eye on this property because every few years, the place does come up for sale. If you're looking to own a piece of Wisconsin's unique history, or maybe you want to start your own brothel, you might want to keep an eye on this place as well. If you are ever bored during a rainy day, or I don't know, during a pandemic, I recommend you start flipping through the newspapers during the Prohibition era. You'd be amazed at how much crime was happening. Every single newspaper is flooded with more crime than you could ever imagine. Now, most of these criminals were terrible at it. They had no business being criminals. They were caught right away, usually in the act. They were thrown into the prisons. Again, no business whatsoever. But some people, they seemed like they were born to be criminals, which of course brings us to our next criminal or gangster, none other than John Dillinger, public enemy number one. If you don't recall Dillinger, he was a bank robber back in 1933 and 34, perhaps the most infamous gangster of all time. Before they played movies, they would throw up his wanted poster like trailers are shown today. And people would actually stand up and start cheering for Dillinger back then, like he was some sort of folk hero. But regardless of what you make of Dillinger, when he came to Wisconsin, trouble seemed to follow him. First stop, just north of where a lot of you are watching this from, Dillinger wanted to rob the Racine Bank in November of 1933. They wanted to make a withdrawal from the American Bank and Trust. In fact, they wanted to take every penny the bank had. So they pulled around back of the building, which looks like this. Their game plan was to leave the car running with their getaway driver, Russell Clark, and then the rest would go in and rob the place. But the problem was that meant they'd have to rob the bank, run all the way around the block, and come to the back because they didn't know there was a tiny little back door. And whether they didn't know this, or maybe they didn't care, perhaps they were even bored with their lives, even though they were bank robbers. They decided to go through with the plan anyway. So they left the car running with Russell Clark. Meanwhile, Dillinger and his gang, which at the time was made up of Dillinger, Harry Pierpont, Three-Finger Jack John Red Hamilton, and Charles Makeley. Makeley's the first one in. He goes right up to the teller who's busy counting out money. And he says, "This is a robbery. Give us the money." The teller, thinking it was a joke, didn't even look up. He just said, "Next window, please." Makeley shot him in the shoulder, and that got his attention. Now, one of the biggest misconceptions about bank robberies of the era was the whole stick 'em up. Most banks had big front windows on them, so anyone coming by would see everyone with their hands up and know it was a robbery and trigger the alarms and notify the police. So the gangsters instead would throw you on the ground out of sight and leave you there and threaten to kill you if you popped your head up, a threat they were more than capable of delivering on. So Makeley shot him, and that got the attention of the police, obviously. and a crowd started gathering out front, and the police raced to the scene. Well, not exactly. Back then, false alarms were very common at banks, so the police took their time getting there. When they got there, they were relieved of their weapons and thrown on the ground with the rest of the hostages. The gangsters scooped up as much money as they could, tens of thousands of dollars, and then grabbed some hostages. They grabbed a young female clerk, the bank manager, and a security guard. The reason they loved the female clerks, and they would use them most often as shields as they walked to their car, believing, rightly so, that the police would be less likely to shoot them if they had young women with them that would then have to ride on the running boards of the vehicles. They also grabbed a bank manager here, and as you can see, a security guard. And then they raced to their car. And they had a very high-tech way of eluding police back then. What they would do is in their back seat, keep a big bucket of roofing tacks. And they would throw those on the ground as they left the bank robbery. In those days, the police had no two-way radios, so all they could do was chase you. So the gangsters would throw these on the road, the police would chase them, pop their tires, and the chase would be over. That's exactly what happened. Dillinger and his gang snuck out of the area to one of their many safe homes in that region of Wisconsin. Today, unfortunately, the bank's no longer there. It's now the Racine Art Museum, or the RAM as it's known. But after the robbery, authorities were able to gather up some of the weapons, the bullet casings. They put all the newspapers together, and they made a nice little memorial for the robbery. But what I love about this is where they decided to put the memorial. Because what better place to put a memorial for the greatest bank robber in U.S. history? Well, there's only one place you'd want to put that, and that was right at your town's police station. Right out in the front lobby is where the memorial sits. But a word of warning, for those of you who are currently on the lam from the law, you may want to stay away from this place because it is a working police station. So you might want to move on to our next gangster and consider yourself lucky at escaping. And this guy, out of all the gangsters I researched for the book and this program, I had the most fun researching and the most trouble researching this gentleman, Lester Gillis, better known as George Babyface Nelson. The reason I had so much trouble with him is you never knew what side of Babyface was going to show up. On the one hand, those who knew him said he was a polite, well-mannered, jovial young man. He was also perhaps the best connected gangster of all time. If you needed a safe house, a weapon, or an introduction to a fellow crook, he could provide all of it. And at a time when many of the gangsters had numerous mistresses, the malls as they were called, Babyface was said to be devoted to his wife Helen and their two young children. But before you start thinking of Babyface as some type of angel, remember I said there was a flip side to him, and that flip side was his anger. In fact, many of his own colleagues would not like working with him because they never knew what he was going to do. There were many times when they were robbing a place, everything went smooth. Not one bullet was fired. The alarms weren't triggered. And then while coming out, Babyface lost his temper and started shooting up the entire downtown, much like he did in Brainerd, Minnesota, where they still have bullets lodged in their buildings. When they robbed a bank and had to divvy up the loot, they made a circle and put Babyface in the middle and let him hand it out. He thought he was in charge, but in actuality, they formed the circle because nobody wanted their back to him, thinking he might just shoot you and take your portion of the money. But when Babyface came to Wisconsin, we got to see both sides of him. First off, Babyface is driving with his wife, Helen. Right behind him is his buddy, Homer Van Meter, and Tommy Carroll driving the car with his girlfriend. So they're driving, they're heading up north. They make it to North Leeds. And in North Leeds, Babyface, just south of Arlington, Wisconsin, Babyface gets in an accident at this crossroads when he runs into a truck employee for a local cannery. Tommy Carroll, who was driving the car with his girlfriend, pulled over back about 100 yards back thinking Babyface is going to shoot this guy and we'll go about our business. But instead, Babyface gets out, goes into the North Leeds grocery store and makes a phone call. And then he comes out and said, let's get our cars fixed. Let's go into Arlington. I'll pay for it all. And that's what they did. Years later, the general store turned in, ironically, to Thirsty's Bar and Grill. But remember, I told you to get to these places while you still can, because a few years back, Thirsty's burned to the ground and there's nothing left of where Babyface made his phone call. So they go into Arlington. They go to the Bell Ford dealership, which is owned by the same family right now, but they built a new building on the outskirts of town. They moved out of this one, but the building's still there. And this is where Babyface went in to get his car fixed. No one knew who he was. Days later, when his picture was plastered all over the newspapers, they realized that it was him getting his car fixed. The entire time he was in there, he had his back to the wall. They thought it was weird, but when you're a gangster, when you have your back to the wall, it means nobody can sneak up on you to arrest you or kill you. Meanwhile, while Babyface is in there, Tommy Carroll parks his car out in front of the Arlington Inn Bar and Grill, which is still there today. He went in. I presumed he was drinking like a fish, thinking at any moment Babyface is going to shoot up the town and we're going to have a gunfight on our hands. But somehow Babyface kept it together, paid his bill, and drove off, Tommy Carroll following close behind. Babyface and his wife made it up north a little bit until they reached Portage, Wisconsin. There, their car, newly repaired, broke down right out in front of this garage owned by A.R. Slinger. Today, kind of in a fun twist, it is now a liquor store. Babyface went inside. The owner told me the store is about the same, the footprint's the same, but instead of having spirits here, they would have cars on display. Babyface left his car to be repaired and said he'd come back and get it. He never would. The FBI would. But Babyface simply hopped in Tommy Carroll's car and the two couples drove north to Little Bohemia, exactly where my car got that flat tire. Manitoush Waters, the north woods of Wisconsin. It was April, which meant it was the off season up there. It wasn't filled with Chicago tourists like it is today. It was completely dead. So the owners were very excited when a group of men pulled up wanting to rent the place for the entire weekend. Money was no object. In fact, the owners said that the men were throwing around money as though they had just robbed a bank. That should have been their first clue. But again, they needed that business. They were excited. But that excitement soon turned to fear when they noticed who walked through the door. Because in 1934, these were the last people you'd want at your place. A who's who of gangsters. Dillinger up in your top left, John Dillinger, of course. Top right, George Babyface Nelson. Bottom right, Tommy Carroll. Middle bottom, Three-Finger Jack, John Red Hamilton. And on your bottom left, Homer Van Meter. Deadly, deadly men. If the FBI could capture these men, they could throw away the most wanted list that they had. Of course, the gangsters had their softer side with them, the malls. They were there too. And in the beginning, the owners were happy. The men were buying all the rounds. They were amazing tippers, telling tremendous stories. The only thing that bothered the owners is all of the men seemed to have a large lump on the side of their jackets. But don't worry, they would find out what those lumps were, because they made the mistake of smuggling out information that Dillinger was in the Northwoods. They finally got word down to Chicago to the FBI division that was run by Melvin Purvis at the time. Now, Purvis flew into Rhinelander, waited for other officers to come from St. Paul, and they drove over just south of Little Bohemia to a place called Voss's Birchwood Lodge. There, they were about to make their plans to how best capture Dillinger. But they got word that instead of leaving the next morning as planned, Dillinger was about to leave at any moment. He had an uncanny knack of knowing when things weren't quite right. So they raced to Little Bohemia. Just after 9 p.m., they got there. Their game plan was to wait for Dillinger to come out and shoot him on sight. But instead, 3 local men who had been eating and drinking there that night went out to their car to go home. The feds panicked. They thought it was Dillinger. They opened fire on the car, killing one, injuring the other 2. Well, now all hell broke loose at Little Bohemia. Babyface, who had been staying in the side cabin because nobody wanted him in the main cabin, could have easily snuck into the woods undetected. Instead, he came out guns blazing. Then he ran into the woods. We'll catch up with Babyface in a minute. But it also bought Dillinger enough time, and his men enough time, to avoid all the shots that were coming in from the government. Not only did they avoid the shots, they had time to escape. What was their elaborate escape plan? It was this. They simply crawled out the back window. The federal authorities, while trying to capture the most elusive men in the world, simply did not know there was a ravine there that could hide the men as they escaped. Tommy Carroll simply hitchhiked his way back to Minneapolis. Dillinger took off running with Three Finger Jack and Homer Van Meter. At gunpoint, they were able to borrow a car and a driver. They wanted to get back to St. Paul, but because every radio station in America was running stories about Babyface shooting up the Northwoods, they knew it would be too hot to go through the north. So they went through the southern town of Hastings, Minnesota, over this old spiral bridge. Police saw the plates were stolen, but again, all they could do was chase them. So they had a running gun battle. For 20 miles, they shot back and forth with the gangsters before Homer Van Meter swerved the car off the road and escaped. Later, the police would find their vehicle. Judging by the amount of blood you see in this abandoned vehicle, they believed whoever was sitting in the front passenger seat would probably die from their gunfight. And they were right. Three Finger Jack did die. He was buried, but it would take them a year to find his grave. They thought he was still alive. Back at Little Bohemia, Babyface should have had the easiest way out, but he had the hardest. He was able to steal a car and he drove it for a bit and it broke down. Then he approached a group of men that were listening to the radio about the shootout. He was going to try to buy a car from them or steal one. And as he's talking to them about the possibility of a ride, a car drives up filled with 2 FBI agents and a local sheriff's deputy. They have no idea who's who, who's a local, who's not. It's dark. They're not from there. They're looking to grab people to come help them fight the gangsters back at Little Bohemia because they thought they were all still there. So Babyface, according to legend, walks over to their vehicle and says, "I know you're wearing vests, so I'm going to give it to you both high and low," and starts shooting. Probably shot without warning right into the car, shooting all 3 of the men and kicking them out of their vehicle and driving off. Unfortunately, one of those FBI agents would die from his gun battle with Babyface. The local sheriff's deputy spent the next couple months in the hospital recovering from his gun wounds with Babyface as well. Babyface drove that car for a while and it broke down. So he started walking. For over 20 miles, he walked through the dark woods until he came to the peninsula near Lac de Flambeau. Here he encountered Ali Catfish and his family, who had a small shack there. He stayed a few nights there, then made his way to Marshfield, got a car, and made his way down to Chicago. Sometime in the early 1940s, or late 30s. They don't know exactly when. The nearby Dillman's Lodge Resort bought that shack, and they brought it over from the peninsula on horse and sleigh to their resort right across the lake there. And they put it there. And it's now cabin number 5 that you can rent out and spend the night. They've upgraded it. It's beautiful, but you have the unique opportunity to spend the night right where Babyface did. Back at Little Bohemia, the feds thought everyone was captured. So when they shot in tear gas hours later, you can imagine their surprise when the only people coming out were the malls and the workers. Everything else was left behind. Much to the credit, they left all the artifacts, the weapons, the personal shaving, the clothing, even the bullet holes were preserved in the windows, all of which you can see to this very day at Little Bohemia. But the gangsters couldn't go on forever. Death came knocking for them, and it came very quickly. First stop, Biograph Theater, July 22nd, Chicago. 1934, you're at the theater with your friends when all of a sudden the guy sitting next to you looks a lot like John Dillinger. And he was being set up. A friend of his by the name of Anna Sage ran some brothels, and she was Romanian and being threatened with deportation. So she thought if she could turn in Dillinger, not only would she get the reward, but they'd have to let her stay in America. So that's what she did. She turned in John. And for her reward, the US government shipped her back to Romania. Now, here's where things get weird. That night, the FBI version of events is that Dillinger came out of the theater, saw the feds there, tried to shoot them, but they were too fast as he ran into the alleyway, and they shot him, and he bled to death waiting for help to arrive in this alley. Witnesses that night tell a different variation of the story. They tell of a well-dressed man coming out of the movie and being shot basically without warning and dying in this alleyway. But regardless of whether either version's true, they finally got Dillinger, and he got his in this alleyway in Chicago. Immediately, thousands of people gathered under the biograph. They got Johnny, they got Dillinger. Can you believe it? But they didn't stop there. They went into the alleyway. Now, another word of caution, these next 2 slides are going to be a bit graphic. If you'd rather not see them, close your eyes, because here's what they did in the alleyway. Again, I'll tell you when these are gone. They dipped their handkerchief or newspaper into the blood of Dillinger as some sort of grisly souvenir. Then they followed him to the morgue where women cut locks of his hair. More blood was stolen. Nearly naked photos of his body were taken. Okay, photos are gone. The last of the big names to go, in Wisconsin, that is, was Babyface Nelson. Down in Lake Geneva, Babyface wanted to come back to the Lake Como Hotel. He had been there several times because the owner, Mr. Hermanson, was a local slot machine baron of the area. But as soon as Babyface got there, the feds were waiting for him. But they didn't recognize him. So he just turned his car around and drove off. As he's driving down the resort town of Lake Geneva, he sees more FBI agents walking down on their streets. So he drives back down to Chicago. And as he's on his way, he passes by your neck of the woods. And then he sees some cars coming up from Chicago to Lake Geneva filled with FBI agents. He's with his wife and his good buddy, John Paul Chase. They run one car into the ditch, and then he goes onto the road and runs the other car into a park in Barrington in the far north suburbs of Chicago, not far from where a lot of you are watching this from. He then gets out, starts shooting, walking toward their vehicle. They're shooting him, he's shooting them. When he reaches their car, he realizes they're in no condition to fire back at him. So he kicks them out of their car and drives off with John Paul Chase and his wife, Helen, following close behind. Unfortunately, both of those agents in the vehicle they would both die from their gunfight with Babyface. And Babyface was filled with bullets all over. He was leaking blood everywhere. So it's no surprise that the next day, his body was found dead on the side of the road. I'm going to show you his morgue photo. If you'd rather not see it, close your eyes. Here's Babyface dead in the morgue in his early 20s. Okay, photo's gone. The last we have to talk about today is that of Ma and Fred Barker. By January of 35, they were the only two still alive or out of prison of the Barker clan. They were renting this home down in Florida. Neighbors thought they were the best neighbors you could have. They didn't know they were gangsters, but they liked that they would give rides in their fancy automobiles and hand out coins and candy to kids. So the FBI found out they were staying there. According to their version of events, they knocked on the door. And when Ma answered, they asked her to surrender peacefully, which she replied, "Let's see what Freddie and his guns have to say about surrendering." In reality, they started shooting without warning. Researchers of that era believe that in the first 30 seconds, Ma and Fred were killed in the gun battle. But for the next several hours, every time the wind blew a curtain or a screen door, they thought it was the gangsters. So they opened fire on the house. It went on so long, neighbors started putting lawn chairs out front like it was some sort of reality TV program. Eventually, after many hours of no gunfire coming from inside, the government finally garnered the courage to force the Barkers' local hired maintenance man inside to see what was going on. And that's when they found Ma and Fred Barker dead. And Ma was this senior unarmed citizen with mild at best intelligence. So they thought maybe the general public would not like them going around shooting unarmed seniors. So they concocted this legend that Ma was this mastermind criminal. But those who knew her when the stories broke, they told the media that that old woman couldn't plan breakfast, much less a bank robbery. But that's how the legend of Ma Barker began. Caution, I'm going to show you their morgue photos. If you'd rather not see their bullet-riddled bodies, close your eyes. Here we go. Fred and Ma Barker dead at the morgue. Okay, photo's gone. As I mentioned, the neighbors thought they were the best neighbors you could have. Even after they found out they were gangsters, they named their local watering hole Ma Barker's Hideaway. You can go there and do some shots or take some shots as you choose. But the gangsters, besides dying, the gangster era ended for three main reasons. One, obviously the repeal of prohibition. Bootleggers making millions of dollars a year, that dried up overnight. Two, the FBI got much better at fighting these men and women. When they first started out, most of them were college graduates who had never fired a weapon in their entire lives. But they got much quicker at saving us from these deadly criminals. And the third and most important reason was because of us. When they were robbing banks, nobody seemed to care. When they were bootlegging, people cared even less. It wasn't until they started killing us and kidnapping us that we turned them in for the outrageous sums of money being offered. So it leaves us with the final question of what do we make of these men and women? Saints, sinners, something in between? That's where I leave it to you to come to your own conclusion. But I think what should be celebrated rather than the characters themselves is the era in which they operated. The Prohibition era was unlike any other era in American history. And I think that's what should be celebrated rather than the characters themselves. So with that, I wanted to save the last 10 minutes or so that we have for any questions, comments, or stories that any of you might have. If you want more information, my website has more than you could ever want or need at Chad Lewis Research. But I hope your adventure doesn't end here with this program. Grab one of my books, go on your own adventure of Wisconsin. And when you do, I think you'll discover that we live in one heck of a weird place. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen. You'll meet some weird people. And along the way, you might just discover that the scariest thing out there is often yourself. But you may want to heed the advice of these next people, because in Wisconsin, who knows what could happen.